to show your support to our military men and women serving in harm's way? Then donate new or used DVDs to AMVET's Task Force DVD today. Since 2006, Task Force DVD has provided millions of hours of entertainment to troops serving on the front lines free of charge. Through your cash or DVD contributions, you can share a little piece of home with our heroes serving around the world. To learn more about Task Force DVD and to become involved, visit amvets.org.
The views and opinions expressed on the show are those of the guests or hosts, and not necessarily those of the advertisers, networks, platforms, or stations. Warning that the content of the show may not be suitable for all audiences, and that viewer discretion is advised. The show does not intend to provide medical, legal, or financial advice, and viewers or listeners should consult with a professional.
Hello, everybody out there. This is Paranormal Intelligence Agency Radio, and I'm your host, Jack Carey, as always, and thanks for being back with us. We've had a bit of a holiday hiatus, and now we're back with new episodes of the PIA, and glad to be back. We've had some interesting things happening, as always, in the paranormal world that we'll be discussing over the last few weeks. The Webbots had some interesting things I've been talking about that it's predicted over the last few weeks. And some of that had to do with, and this was prior to the whole drone affair that actually is still taking place, by the way. They're not reporting it, but the drones are still appearing all over the place. And that was predicted by Cliff High's Webbot over at halfpasthuman.com. And the Webbot's something that we cover here routinely on the show, and kind of compare it to what other people are predicting and saying and doing in the paranormal world. And we call that cyber prophecy. That's the place where remote viewing and language data trend analysis, which is the Webbot, and ancient prophecy all come together pointing in the same direction. And cyber prophecy is something that's becoming more and more a regular segment on the show, it seems like, because a lot of interesting stuff has been predicted. And let's face it, some very important time markers that were predicted by the Webbot years ago have now taken place. Some of that I've mentioned previously had to do with Donald Trump appearing on the Joe Rogan podcast. That was a major temporal marker, and I've described temporal markers before. It's important that people understand that time is a funny thing. And you guys might get a treat with some barking dogs here in a minute, but that's live radio. Anyway, the Webbot predicted what's called a melee in the skies, and was supposed to begin in January. And with the drone sightings that seems to have taken place, the Donald Trump Joe Rogan podcast was a major temporal marker. And these temporal markers are kind of like driving towards a mountain range, and you're going to get to the mountain range at some point, but you never know quite how long it's going to take you to get there because your car doesn't have a speedometer and you don't have a clock. But you're going to reach the mountain range. Well, that's kind of how these events are predicted in the Webbot, is you never know quite how long the time period is between the events, but you do know that when one of the events predicted takes place, the probability of the larger event that always occurs after that is extremely high probability. That probability ended up being the melee in the skies, which is still taking place. This will progress over the course of a number of months to the point where you'll see physical confrontations taking place literally in our skies. That's what's being predicted. So it's interesting because Cliff High this week was talking about how his Webbot and the predictions being produced by the Webbot, which predicts the language, the future language that's going to be used in media sources. So you have to consider that. It's talking about what headline language is going to be reading on newspapers and stuff like that. That's what it basically predicts. And he's saying that those predictions have made it so far afield now. They've rippled out to that place where he's beginning to get attention and invites, actual invites from mainstream media podcasts. Now that's fascinating because, you know, Cliff High and the rest of us in paranormal land, we live in what's called woo world. That's the place where most journalists and credible media outlets don't dare to tread. And that's because of the fantastic nature of a lot of this stuff that we cover. Let's not mention the fact that they like to look past all of the good evidence because it makes them feel comfortable. But it's interesting that mainstream podcasts are approaching him, and this is going to give him the ability to talk about how in the very near future, and we say near future, we're talking about over the course of the next 2 to 2.5 years, there's going to be widespread acceptance of aliens on the moon. I know that sounds fantastical, but the Webbot is not only predicting that, but it's predicting headlines that basically are going to read to the effect that there is open conflict between humans and the aliens on the moon. Beyond that, it goes on to predict a sort of face-to-face with the aliens over the next 2.5 years, and that face-to-face contact with humanity is sort of a forced contact. At some point, it becomes a forced interaction. So, that's very, very interesting. The Webbot says, you know, that this, I had previously stated that not only the Webbot, but some very prominent remote viewing groups had predicted that there was going to be a interaction of U.S. military conducting some type of major operation on U.S. soil, and that there was some sort of conflict involved with that. Well, the Webbot is ruling out any sort of idea of an open war, like, for example, China invading the U.S. or something like that. It is ruling any of that out, which literally kind of lends itself to the idea that there's going to be a civil conflict of some kind that involves the U.S. military on U.S. soil. So be aware of that. You know, we at the PIA monitor all the mainstream news sources, and along with all of these, you know, news sources that are online, everything from hundreds of feeds, thousands maybe on Twitter, to all over the world, you can really see the illusion that's taking place all around the world. And the fact that a lot of these news outlets don't report a lot of the more interesting news that's actually taking place. And I bring that up because the Webbot also predicts that this sort of falling out between the public and mainstream media only gets worse. In fact, it gets profoundly worse over a very short period coming up, to the point apparently where media sources won't even be able to do reports outside in the open anymore, because there will be things like physical attacks and things like that taking place. It becomes that bad. So that's something that we have to look forward to. And, you know, the Webbot basically says that we're at war right now. The secret space program, whoever it is that's running things in the industrial war complex with the reverse engineered alien craft that some of our guys are flying around, are in an open conflict right now with an alien intelligence that's on the moon. And it might sound insane, but there are even indications that the moon itself may not be what it seems. It might, in fact, be a construction, which I find utterly fascinating. What would be the profound repercussions of something like that being true? I don't know, but aliens on the moon is something that we will be talking about. Tonight's show, for the main topic, I'm going to be talking about, well, a couple of different things. One thing we're going to talk about is Dogman, everybody's favorite. And the other, and we're going to be talking about Dogman in honor of the release of one of my new books. I have 2 new books that have been released, and one of them is my first work of fiction, and it's just called Shadows of Time. You can find it out there by Jack Carey. It's about psychic twins that hunt down a serial killer who has a magical watch that allows him to stop time just long enough to perpetrate perfect murders. And my second book is simply called Dogman, Legend Meets Science, a field investigator's guide to the Dogman mystery. And I think it's something that's been needed in the Dogman research world for a while now. There's a lot of good books on Dogman out there, but there's no real field manuals that you can kind of follow and go by, okay, this is the kind of evidence we need, and this is how we collect it, etc. And so I wrote a field manual for that, and it even explores how to talk to witnesses, how to interview witnesses, how to not ask leading questions, the whole thing. If you're an investigator out there in the world and you are unfamiliar with the Dogman mystery, this book's for you. If you've investigated Dogman cases before like I have, then this book's for you. So I hope that you enjoy it. But it's interesting because I was kind of torn between topics. I wanted to talk about alien hybrids and the idea that alien hybrids are walking among us. And I realized that in a very strange way, it segments into the Dogman phenomenon. And it segments in that way through something that we call the Hitchhiker effect. And that's something that I discuss on this show routinely, and we'll get into that. But I always like to do paranormal in the news. There's a lot of really interesting articles out there. Here at the PIA, as part of the subscriber information that I provide on the paraintelagency.com website for subscribers, we literally monitor hundreds and hundreds of news feeds. We have smart news programs that seek out all of the different paranormal headlines from around the world and bring them back for us to sift through. And I go through those each week looking for new and interesting and paranormal intelligence to share with all of you. And it's interesting because this week we have a article from TMZ talking about UFO Revolution docuseries, which is Jeremy Corbell's new docuseries. It's supposed to be pretty darn good, guys. So I would encourage everybody to check it out. Some people think that Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp and some of the other guys, Christopher Mellon, etc., are all CIA plants in the disclosure movement. I'm not so sure that's the case. it's interesting how as we get closer and closer to full disclosure, everybody's kind of pointing a finger at everybody else saying, are you CIA? Which I guess goes to tell you and goes to show you how successful the CIA has been at infiltrating the ufology community in the past, and ever since the days of Richard Doty and the Mirage Men and their culpability in the suicide of a UFO witness that had come across something he wasn't supposed to. Richard Doty is out there in the world. He was he openly admits, part of a counterintelligence group working for the Air Force that misled an individual into believing a bunch of things that he then shared with the UFO community, and as a result ended up in him having a psychotic break and subsequently committing suicide. So, there are casualties in this war. And there's been a lot of them over the years. And that's another reason for this battle going on behind the scenes of disclosure. But it's with this profound discovery within the Pentagon and their study of UFOs that they refer to as the Hitchhiker effect. The idea that almost 100% of the people involved with the Pentagon's program studying UFOs and who had, in many cases, up-close encounters with those UFOs or studied people who did. For example, the sailors on board the Nimitz and other naval craft all went home at some point to experience in their homes a wide array of other kinds of paranormal activity. So imagine you're a secret agent working at the Pentagon. You get the dream job of a lifetime studying an alien presence on our planet. And that's fascinating enough. But then you go home at the end of a hard working day and you sit down in your living room and all of a sudden objects begin flying across the room. You go to bed that night and all of a sudden full black shadow entities appear and walk across your bedroom. All of a sudden you have cryptid animal encounters that can be explained. That's the Hitchhiker effect. And not only did it affect 100% of the people involved directly with the program, but then like a paranormal virus, it began to spread outward. And as it spread outward, it began to affect other family members. Then it began to affect the neighbors and the neighbors' kids and the neighbors' friends. And it kept going like that. And all of this was documented and described and written about in the book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, that was penned by Dr. Colm Kelleher, a world-renowned scientist that was also employed at Skinwalker Ranch under Robert Bigelow, and George Knapp, who everybody knows is the journalist out of Las Vegas who broke the story of Bob Lazar in Area 51 originally, and who has his own docuseries on Netflix, which is quite good and which I spoke of on a previous episode. It looks like they caught some smoking gun evidence of a UAP pretty close up, going from space to our atmosphere to into the ocean, a true transmedium craft. And when you see it on film, you can clearly tell that if that's human-made, then there is indeed a breakaway civilization that's been hiding technology from the rest of us. Otherwise, it had to be alien. And I bring up the Hitchhiker effect in relationship to my new book on the Dogman mystery, because all of this Hitchhiker effect stuff that was going on during their program culminated in a profound Dogman encounter. Think about that. One of the highest ranked intelligence agent to ever grace Skinwalker Ranch and actually operate on the ranch, goes by the code name Axelrod, appears in the book. I think that's fascinating, the name Axelrod. Apparently, Axelrod is a name used by quite a few different CIA agents, and I say that because that's the name of the CIA agent who Ingo Swann had approached him about viewing aliens on the moon. Something I mentioned earlier, and we had a whole episode about that. And all of this ties together into one big, vast web of complexity. So this high-ranking intelligence agent is on Skinwalker Ranch, and he's got a couple of other agents with him, and they're doing a night patrol, and all of a sudden they come across what feels like to them a menacing force. They couldn't see it. It was invisible, but it was a true entity, a field of energy, something that they ran into on the ranch, which instilled within them a paralyzing fear. And it was one of the more profound encounters that any of them had on the ranch. I might mention here that it's on Skinwalker Ranch that a number of cryptid animal sightings occurred in conjunction with all of the other high strangeness taking place at the ranch. And one of those was the so-called dino beaver, the half dinosaur, half beaver-like creature that was spotted and written about in Hunt for the Skinwalker and Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. Another was a dire wolf, apparent dire wolf that was impregnable to high-level, high-powered rifles that were pretty close up, and this thing just strolled off like it wasn't even hit by anything. Well, I mention that because after this encounter at Skinwalker Ranch with these intelligence agents and this invisible predator-like force, 1,000 miles away in Langley, Virginia, not far from the CIA headquarters, Axelrod's wife was preparing for bed, or actually had gotten up from bed to go get a glass of water from the kitchen sink in the middle of the night, that same night, and was pouring a glass of water, looked out of her kitchen window across their property, and standing next to a tree, 8-9 feet tall, bipedal, upright, canine-headed creature with glowing eyes staring back at her. She thought she was losing her mind. So that's fascinating. And when she looked out, the thing basically grinned, gave her a menacing type of grin. She went back to bed. That's all she could do. Frightened, fearful, went back to bed. The following Saturday morning at 10 a.m., so you're talking about bright daylight outside, the two teenagers of the family see movement at the game room window and look up to see this dogman creature staring in at them. They ran over to the window to notice it kicking up leaves as it ran off. So you're talking about a physical creature of some kind. Now, the scientists at the Pentagon and in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon equated that interaction as being part of the overall Hitchhiker effect. So that is utterly fascinating, and leads us into some really, really interesting areas. But before we get back to Dogman, I wanted to talk about a few other articles that we have before our break. Pathos is running an interesting article about demons and UAPs in the Pentagon. And I had mentioned this previously. There are 3 groups vying for control of the disclosure movement in the Pentagon. Behind the scenes, they are battling one another. One is pro-ET, one is anti-ET, and one is just, well, bat, you know what, crazy. And they are called the Collins Elite, and they truly believe in the idea that any and all UFO activity is simply biblically demonic, and there is no other explanation. No real aliens, no real craft, no aliens on the moon, no anything like that, no alien abduction unless they're demons doing it, etc. And so those are the three groups that are basically deciding the fate of disclosure behind the scenes, and we're just seeing the little ripples on the surface, if you will. News Nation is running a story about how they have a whistleblower who says the UFO retrieval program exists, and News Nation is a major news network, guys. His name is Jake Barber, and he was contracted as a helicopter pilot to retrieve all kinds of craft which he believes are of non-human origin. Check that out on News Nation because that's a major story. There's a new Department of Justice drone policy could fuel even more conspiracy theories. So Popular Science is talking about the drones. Sean Ryan on his podcast has a Green Beret that claims that alien tech is being stored at underground naval base, and that's a really good podcast. It's also an article being run by Daily Mail. So let's see if there's anything else worth mentioning. And that brings us to, well, Lou Elizondo. And this brings us back into our main topic, but I'll get back to that right after our break, guys, and I'll see you in just a little bit.
Not on my watch, our military service members say, as they volunteer to serve. Not on my watch, they say, as they leave their families behind to keep the rest of ours safe. As they move out, stand firm, and take fire. So not on our watch, we say, to the severely ill or injured veterans who can't get the care they deserve, the therapists they need to walk again, the treatment they need to talk again, the lifetime of day-to-day help they need to live full and independent lives. When there's no more government funding, or a nursing home seems like the only option, or everyone says there's no hope for recovery, we won't leave one warrior behind. Not on our watch. Find out how you can do your part at findwwp.org.
knows what lurks, what deceives. Lost in thought, we drift away. Different world in the light of day. Past and present blend as one. In the forest where there's no sun, ghostly visions, they come and go. Secrets hidden we may not know. Dogman prowls, Bigfoot roams. In these woods they make their homes.
This is Jack Carey, your host here at the Paranormal Intelligence Agency Radio, and we've been discussing Dogmen. We've been discussing the Hitchhiker effect and how there was a profound Dogman encounter involved with the Hitchhiker effect, and I bring that up because not only because of the release of my new Dogman book, which you can find on Amazon. There's a shameless plug for you. It really brought to mind this particular case in conjunction with some Dogman cases that I investigated in the field. But what's interesting is that through the Hitchhiker effect, we have a sort of very strange segue into tonight's other topic, which would seemingly be otherwise unrelated, which I was going to discuss, which is alien abduction, and the idea of hybrids walking among us. And this is how the segue is because not only was this Dogman encounter reported as part of all of this taking place, this Hitchhiker effect, but also as part of the Hitchhiker effect, what they listed in their report from the Pentagon that went to our actual Congress members that are basically part of the committees overseeing all of these hearings having to do with UFO disclosure, was the fact that they counted both an unexplained pregnancy and an alien abduction experience as being part of the Hitchhiker effect. In other words, people related to people in the program, one of them had a pregnancy that just disappeared, and that was studied by the scientists and the doctors at the Pentagon, where the baby literally just disappeared, and her body looked like it had never even been pregnant before, even though they had all of the ultrasounds and all of the stuff prior to that. And she was related to somebody in the program that was part of all of this Hitchhiker effect taking place. Well, another part of the Hitchhiker effect that they talk about was alien abduction. They had unexplained or missing time, and this is something a number of our sailors also reported. Imagine my surprise then when last week Lou Elizondo, who used to head up the program for the Pentagon initially under ATIP, and who is now part of a disinformation campaign against him going on by members of the Pentagon, which is fascinating. But Lou Elizondo, who is world famous now in ufology circles, he's one of the main members out there, one of the main guys in the whole disclosure melee taking place right now. And he spoke last week with Ross Coulthart, the famous journalist who's employed by News Nation, in which he openly admits that at one point he was personally shown, an alien implant by a Department of Defense scientist, and that implant had been removed from a member of the United States military. Think about that. That's huge, coming from somebody like Lou Elizondo. And that led me into what I really wanted to discuss tonight, is the idea, because this is something that's hitting mainstream lately, the idea that maybe the aliens succeeded in their program to introduce hybrids into the societies of the world. I say that because of the work from a lot of different scientists that have studied alien abductees and their cases, and one of them is Dr. David M. Jacobs, who wrote the book Walking Among Us, The Alien Hybrid Threat. And I highly encourage any and all people to read that book. His first book is called The Threat. The second book is called Walking Among Us. And in it, he presents a number of alien abductee witnesses who say that the new hybrids, they look just like us. And that it's taken the ETs, the gray aliens, approximately 8 generations in order to achieve it. But according to all of the testimony, that comes with a nasty little surprise for the rest of us. And that surprise is the fact that these hybrids, which, according to their testimony, are being basically introduced into our society as actual citizens, are neurologically superior to humans. In other words, they have the ability, just like the gray aliens do, to control human emotion, thought, and action within a given range. The length of that range is currently unknown, but the range described by abductees of the creatures that are the gray aliens and the creatures that appear to be above the gray aliens, which are the praying mantis-like creatures, have extreme neurological superiority. In other words, they appear to have the ability to seize a human mind from a very long distance. The gray aliens actually have the ability to look into your eyes once they take off their black eye coverings, which is what those big black almond things are. They can stare into your eye to the point where they seize the optic nerve, and then they can project images into your brain. And that's how they overlay one memory on top of another. Now, why they choose to do that and why they choose to have remained, well, as hidden from humanity as they've chosen to be, is very interesting. And I used to think for a long time that what we were seeing wasn't alien. It wasn't an invasion. There's no invasion and there's no need to invade. What you're seeing is a planetary acquisition. That's a big, big difference. And then I came across the remote viewers over at farsight.org, and it fascinated me that many of the targets that they were targeting were dovetailing and matching up perfectly with information I was receiving from many different other sources, except in their version of what's taking place, according to their remote viewings, there is in fact a conflict that's about to become an open conflict. Well, that's interesting because that matches basically what the Webbot is predicting. And that open conflict is between two different groups of ETs, each one with a different goal in mind for the human species. And when I came across that information, I began to ask myself a really interesting question. What good does it do you to infiltrate another species, to assume positions within their society, but not do anything to change the society itself? You don't alter anything. According to abductee testimony, there were no plans to all of a sudden introduce us into sci-fi world where we're getting all this great technology. It's not like that. The program, whatever it is, whatever their end goal is something far more mysterious than that. It's almost as if you were planning a prison break, and the only way for you to create the prison break is from the inside. And the only way for you to get inside is to look like the other prisoners. Is that a possibility? Could it be that the Greys, who have been conducting the hybridization program all these many decades, at least for 80 years, well, at least going back to 1961 with the Betty and Barney Hill abduction in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, are we looking at the actions of the good ETs? Were they trying to introduce members of their genetic lineage into our society in such a way that they can create the prison break that's necessary from the intentions of the bad ETs that basically have this prison as this planet as a prison? It's an interesting idea. It's an interesting theory, and all theories I've learned are equal until one is proven true, and hopefully in our future we will begin to see the truth of what's taking place. Another highly viable theory, if you follow the Rendlesham UFO event, is the idea that these are time travelers, that they are humans from the future, that something went tragically genetically wrong with the human species, and that they are back here collecting DNA samples in order to repair that DNA damage in a future world of humanity. Is that possible? Well, anything almost is in a universe like this that is probably a hologram. And when we look at the alien abduction phenomenon, we have to ask some really interesting questions, like why is it they always bring them back? And why is it that so many different abductees have come back to tell us that they've had conversations with the Greys, with their abductors? This happens routinely where abductees have conversations with the abductors in which information is actually relayed to them. The one question that has never been answered in any abductee testimony that's ever been collected by any respected abductee researcher is the reason why. They talk about everything else, how it's done, but they'll never tell you why it's done. They'll tell you that, according to abductee testimony, and I've gone through hundreds and hundreds of cases, they feel, the aliens, is who I refer to with they feel like they have a right to do what they're doing. So that could go all the way back to the so-called treaty that was signed by Eisenhower. A lot of people believe a treaty was signed by some leaders around the world, including President Eisenhower, which allowed for human abduction and experimentation. But let's face it, if that's the case, then they've gone way beyond anything that was probably agreed to. And what would stop them from going even further than that? Really nothing. And conducting a hybridization program where they're actually creating beings that look just like us but have the alien life wave within them is not something probably that was included in the treaty. So there's all kinds of ins and outs and avenues to explore when we go down this particular rabbit hole. And I ask the question, is this where disclosure is ultimately headed? Is it headed towards the dark heart of the mystery itself, which I believe is the alien abduction phenomenon? The alien abduction phenomenon, whether the ETs who are perpetrating it are the good ones or the malevolent ones, and perhaps both groups are doing it for their own ends, tells us something about our relationship to the cosmos currently as a species. It's interesting because, many of us ascribe to the prison planet hypothesis, the idea that humanity is somewhat imprisoned on this planet. We've been quarantined here, if you will. And we're only allowed to achieve certain achievements in space. There's been a number of different space rockets and craft gone missing and blown up and things like that by what appear to be alien craft, which means they're sort of containing us in a way. On the and when you talk about motives, that's the least of what they're doing, and it brings to mind. Interestingly enough, while I'm sitting here talking, is the Sean Ryan podcast that happened last year, in which a Green Beret claims to not only have come across with his group of soldiers in the jungles of Colombia, they came across a hovering UFO. And he claims that from a distance he saw human beings in crates being loaded into the bottom of this craft. That's the Sean Ryan podcast. That's a podcast that's getting as big as Joe Rogan's podcast. So when you're beginning to see that kind of information coming out into the public, and groups like Farsight.org releasing their remote viewing saying that, yes, indeed, there seems to be some sort of cosmic human trafficking taking place, then maybe that's what we're seeing. We're seeing both sides of the coin. The good ETs who are trying to break us out of this prison, and the bad ETs who are predating on humanity. But all of this is interesting in the eyes of a cryptozoologist, because connected to all of this and feeding back onto it is cryptozoology itself when we're examining the so-called woo animals like Sasquatch, Bigfoot, animals like the Dogman. And I talk extensively in my new book about the ET connection to Dogman and Dogman sightings. It is something that's been well documented in a number of cases. There are many people out there that study the phenomenon of Bigfoot, study the phenomenon of Dogman. A lot of people involved in the Bigfoot community are also heavily involved in the Dogman research community. And that's because we think that they must, if both of them are living, viable, breathing, and breeding species, they must in some way share some of the same habitat. And if so, does that lead to confrontation of some kind? How is it these species can cohabitate with one another? And why is it that in 20% of all Bigfoot sightings, 20% of all highly credible Bigfoot sightings also report seeing a UFO or anomalous light at the same time? How is it that in a very large number of Dogman sightings, and as yet we don't have an actual percentage because Dogman sightings modern day Dogman sightings really haven't had the same sort of statistical analytical analysis that Bigfoot sightings have had over the decades, but we know from all of the hundreds and hundreds of encounters, eyewitness encounters that come in over the course of a year, that many of them report seeing a UFO or an anomalous light at the scene. Add to that the idea of a upright walking canine-headed species goes against really any sort of natural biological processes that we can imagine according to our understanding of biology. Now, chimera animals can be created. And I would argue that what you're looking at with the Dogman species is a chimera created on a level that we can't even come close to comprehending in our laboratories here on the Earth. In human laboratories, chimera work is taking place. This usually involves two species that would not be able to reproduce naturally. They're able to fuse genes of one species into another, thereby creating a hybrid of the two. And what we might be witnessing with the Dogman phenomenon is a chimera created by the same alien intelligence that we know is on this planet. The real question then becomes, for what ends and to what purpose do those creatures exist? And why would an alien civilization, an alien species, go to the trouble of introducing a cryptid animal like that into the ecology of the Earth? That's another big question that we haven't yet understood or even really begun to ask. A number of the Dogman cases and eyewitnesses I've come across have reported, one of them reported a Dogman running through the woods, and they looked up because they saw movement and there was a UFO literally following just above it. It's cases like that that really fascinate me. I investigated the so-called Lakewood lichen case outside of Denver, Colorado, that became a world-famous case. And in that case, we were able to determine that the creature was physical. It left physical trace evidence behind. The eyewitness, we were lucky enough that the eyewitness happened to be a artist. So they were able to draw a eyewitness sketch that was like no other. It was quite detailed and interesting. And we were able to determine that this creature had a viable habitat pathway to make it all the way into the suburbs of Denver. And that's something that differs a lot from Bigfoot. The Bigfoot mystery is that a number of Dogman sightings and occurrences have occurred within what we would call city limits. Not something that's normally attributed to any Bigfoot sighting. You know, if you've ever had a Bigfoot report come in that it was running through the middle of town, those are usually towns that have like 20 residents and they're way out in the middle of nowhere and the thing was throwing trash cans around and the dogs were barking. I've had a report like that before. That's completely different than the Dogman phenomenon, in which a number of high-level cases that have come in were from people that were literally within city limits and had an encounter with one of these creatures. So really, in conclusion, we're sort of at the beginning stages of understanding the Dogman phenomenon. The late, great Linda Godfrey, who broke the story of the Beast of Bray Road and really sort of ushered in a new understanding, a modern day understanding of the Dogman phenomenon, was contacted once by a man claiming to be a CIA-trained remote viewer. He provided documentation to that effect. She was able to verify it. She was, in fact, a credentialed and awarded journalist for her day job. And this man began to proceed to tell her that they had targeted the Dogman sightings. And what they were able to determine was that it was, in fact, created by an ET intelligence, that there were a number of them, that they were somehow living and surviving down in the deepest recesses of the Earth, that they possessed a type of technology, an alien technology still, in the form of these little orbs that they carry around, and they're able to basically activate these orbs and project themselves from one geographic location to another. That's how advanced they are. He described a type of bio armor that they wear. And so what we're seeing is the government interested deeply in this phenomenon too. But this has been another episode of Paranormal Intelligence Agency Radio. Join us again next week as we jump back down the rabbit hole. We're not afraid to chase those rabbits. So I'll see you next week, guys. Thanks for being with me.